thank you both for joining me today on the Land and Everything Else podcast. I'm with two of my very dear friends, also have a firm, Model Wealth. And so, Randy and Alex, let you introduce yourselves.
I am Randy Bruns, and I've known Craig for, I don't know how long. When did we meet?
7 or 8 years.
7-8 years. We've done speaking events together at local libraries, community colleges, but and Alex and I have worked together at Model Wealth since when? 2015?
2016.
2016. I founded the firm in 2012 after a career at JP Morgan Chase, where I finally was ready to go independent and had my own way of wanting to do business. And that's how Model Wealth started. And Alex, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Alex Offerman. I'm a financial planner at Model Wealth, and I joined Randy back in 2016 after I always joke I forced him to hire me. So
it's a way to go.
It worked well. It's worked out well so far. So about 8 years coming up in July or June. So right after college, I forced Randy to hire me, and here we are today.
And it was the most awkward hire too, because I'm working for I call it the mothership. So when I left JP Morgan Chase, I just wanted to be an independent financial planner, but I did not know anything about the legal filings and whatnot. Alex worked for the compliance firm that I had worked under, and he comes into my office one day and said, "What are you doing?" And I was working on an hourly based project for a client, and he said, "This is cool. Would you hire me?" I said, "Alex, you tell the mothership this is your idea, because don't make me look like I'm picking off their one of their top employees."
I, of course, made it look like he was picking off one of the top employees, but I decided.
To this day.
Yeah, to this day. I also like how you said top employees. That was good.
I like that. That's some good praise. Yeah. Well, I wanted to bring Randy and Alex on, not just because they're good friends, but Model Wealth has a unique, I would say, unique model that they work with clients. And maybe it should be unique, maybe it shouldn't be unique, but at the end of the day, Model Wealth is one of the firms in Chicagoland that does project-based fees, right? So it's looked at by the project, by the customer, by the client, and not an AUM model, right? And so I think that's an interesting perspective. And we're going to have a 2-part series together. So you're stuck with me for 2 of these. And I'm actually real excited that you are. But the first thing I wanted to dive into today was an episode about rental property. And what's driven me to this episode, there's a few factors in my head driving us here. The first is, rental property is a path to wealth for so many Americans, and legitimately so. And it's a path to wealth in certain cultures, perhaps more than others, but we see rental properties as a staple of building wealth in the U.S. And at the same time, it's something that in my experience, in my career, financial advisors tend to stay away from advising on, stay away from talking about, and kind of take that element of rental properties and put it in a slightly different category that we don't entirely know how to work with, right? And then the third part of this is that, man, I can't, Instagram and TikTok is just all about buying doors, having rentals, building wealth, power building wealth, right? And like these absurdly wealthy people telling us all that we need to buy rentals for our future. So I thought from that financial planning standpoint, I wanted to have a conversation about rentals. I couldn't think of a better firm to have that conversation with. So thanks y'all for being here to that end. So I guess let's open it up. When you are working with clients that y'all have, when you've got rental property, how do you talk about it? How do you parse it? What conversations do you have around it? We'll start there and we'll see where this goes.
I just love that every time Craig talks, you can tell he's from Texas because he says y'all a lot.
I do.
Yeah,
I do. Y'all got those rentals, yeah?
Yes. I'll let you talk.
No, Alex, you handle it.
Yeah. So what we normally do if a client walks in with rentals or wants a rental property, we first try to say, hey, let's make sure that everything else is sound, to make sure that their financial plan is together, make sure that they have enough investments, things like that. Once we have that checked off, then we can start talking about the rental discussion on when and where and how to do so. There's a lot of red flags ultimately that comes up with the rental properties that a lot of individuals ultimately think it's going to be super simple, and it turns out to be a nightmare. Randy has some stories that he could probably go through about
I have the worst rental story because it's about me, so that I'm biased a little bit, but yet I see individuals who come in and they're just incredibly wealthy because they've done this their whole life. So there are extreme ends.
Absolutely. So when we have clients that actually walk into our office with rentals, we first make sure that they're set up properly from a liability standpoint, making sure that if they don't have an LLC, discuss the pros and cons of having that rental property in an LLC, discussing the ability to take money out of the LLC so they're not piercing that veil, so on and so forth. So those are some ways that we discuss them, but I'll toss this over to Randy to have some additional comments there.
So Alex is right that we want to make sure that, first of all, do you have the free cash flow? If this rental property didn't go as planned,
okay,
maybe you couldn't find a renter or whatever, does it have a material effect on your life? Obviously, the liability coverage, you want to make sure there's insurance coverage for it. You want to make sure you have like a separate cash fund if the furnace breaks or whatever, but you also have to enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, you can maybe, and when I say enjoy it, like waking up to a call at 11 p.m. or midnight or 1 p.m., 1 a.m., whatever, and having to go do that. Because if you're not going to do it, you can hire a property manager, but a
Sure.
property manager will cost close to, roughly 10% of the rent maybe. So you do have to factor all that in.
So do you look at it from the standpoint, I like a phrasing you just said, material impact on a financial plan. So do y'all look at it from the standpoint that, okay, this rental is ancillary, or do you look at it from the standpoint that we want our baseline covered without the rental? Like where does material play into that? Or is there some kind of rule you use with a percentage of net worth? Kind of getting into the quant a little more with that.
So, and it's very similar to, we have individuals that have just a lot of Apple stock, for example. So the way we look at that is, maybe it's 20% of somebody's net worth, for example. And we just look and say, well, if this goes to zero, is your life materially impacted? So, and by material impacted, I'd say like if it goes to zero, can you still put food on the table, pay your property taxes? Like if it just affects your ability to take an extravagant vacation, okay, well, go to Door County, Wisconsin instead of Hawaii.
Is there a hard and fast percentage of net worth you stick to? Do you try to have baseline expenses elsewhere, or is it a situation by situation?
I think it's a very situation by situation scenario. If it's somebody who's never rented before, we're going to be a lot more cautious about that. If it's somebody who has rented for 20, 30 years and knows what they're doing, and they have good renters, or especially if, let's say they're using a property manager and their cash flow is covered, I think we'd be a lot more lenient in saying, hey, you know what you're doing, you've got the backstop of the property manager. But if it's a very fresh, like a rookie situation, you got to be a lot more careful.
Okay.
And to piggyback off of that, we have two distinct scenarios that come to mind with our clients. Is we have one client that is younger, in their low 40s, young 40s, and they have 17 rental properties. And it's majority of their portfolio. I would say it's probably 70% of their investable net worth is in these rental properties. And that is completely different because they have built up the financial capacity or their financial wherewithal to be able to manage those properties. They have a property manager that they have now been really good with, and they have cut that 10% down to 5% because how many properties they manage and things like that. The economies of scale help in that scenario.
And this individual also gets first rights of refusal from realtors, because he's done this for so long.
Exactly. And then we have another individual that came to us the other day and said, hey, should I buy this? And they don't have they don't have a large amount saved in an after-tax brokerage account. If there was a issue with the property, they would have to pull it out of a 401k or traditional IRA, which is not by any means optimal in the financial world. So it is by a situation basis of where the client stands from a financial standpoint, also from an income standpoint, if they have a job, W-2 job, or if they're self-employed, things like that. So Craig, to your point, it's probably situation by situation.
So Alex, this one might be for you, but walk me through that. So that second situation, right?
Yes.
Is maybe we're not ready yet, right? And have that conversation. When y'all look at portfolio allocation and when you work with clients in that space in wealth management, when is maybe a REIT a better fit or an actual rental a better fit? And if you could put your professor hat on for a minute and kind of walk me through that.
Yeah,
I think it'll be real helpful for our audience.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think it all comes down to the risks that you are willing to take and how hands-on you want to be. I know Randy mentioned that a moment ago. If you don't want to be hands-on with the real estate, but you want to have some sort of that in your portfolio, then a REIT is an excellent example, either a non-tradable or a tradable. We would probably prefer the tradable REITs, meaning the open markets, secondary markets, to be able to buy and sell that and have that liquid. Or if you are really hands-on and you want to dive into it, then great. Let's try to start with a starter rental property and see how that goes from there, and get your toes in the water and discuss that and what kind of liability protections, things like that need to go. But from a REIT versus a rental property, it all depends on how impactful or how much the client wants to actually put into that property or put into that real estate position themselves. And Randy may have some.
Well, and I think it's interesting. I do think there is like an allure to owning property or real estate, just because you hear like, oh, you know, my grandpa bought that house for a nickel back in wherever, and not a nickel, but let's say like you remember what you paid for it. And then 40 years later, you see let's say it's worth, you paid $50,000, and 40 years later, it's worth, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. But you forget like all the repairs that went in, all the property taxes that went in, and you don't get a statement every single second of the trading day saying, this is what the house is worth. Right? This is what the house is worth. This is what the house is worth. Whereas if you put it in the market, whether it be a stock, a bond, or a REIT, for example, now you get to see it every second of the trading day. And now it starts to feel like money, even though it's not money.
Okay. So I hear you from that front.
Yeah. And it's just not sexy, like buying a rental property. So that's my opinion too.
So taking that and moving a step then forward would be, you know, when you are working with clients and rental properties, do you find they're interested in, you know, a house? Do you find they're interested in, you know, the apartment, the small apartment building? You know, what scale in the retail space do you see?
Yeah, I would say it's a lot of single family homes to start. The individuals that we have that have rental properties have started with a single family house. They have then built up to another single family house, and then another one, and then ultimately go into, let's say, a 4-flat home or a 4-flat apartment building. So I think it starts with a single family residence, and then it starts to build upon there once they get more comfortable into the larger areas, a commercial building, commercial apartment building. I don't think that we've had a client that wanted to have dive in directly to an apartment building all at once or for just to start. But
I would think that's a weird
dive. The one that Alex mentioned earlier, that individual, the one that owns the 17 properties or whatever, he is looking at apartment buildings, but that's a one-off situation.
But that he has built up that. He's understood where the properties are, how much it takes to manage those properties, getting the phone calls at 11 o'clock at night to go and fix the leaky toilet, for example, things like that are not the glamorous side of owning those properties.
And I do think we have individuals who, you know, they buy their first starter home, and then when it comes time to when they grow out of that starter home, they think, well, wait, should we sell this or should we rent it out? I have a friend who, you know, he could rent it out throughout the year, but he's turned it into an Airbnb. So he's charging $250 a night. And if you multiply $250 a night, if that was occupied 365 days a year, which it's not,
that's a ton of cash.
That's a lot of cash versus, like, let's just say he could get $2,500 or $3,000 a month. And I did some math. It's like, well, if all he needs to do is have it rented for maybe 7 or 8 months out of the year versus find a renter all year long, he would make a killing. And that's...
Well, I think that's the allure of Airbnb properties, right?
Yeah.
There's the allure of it.
Yeah.
But I think I'd love, you know, if you wouldn't mind sharing your story of your rental, because what I do, I want to pivot into risk management in a minute, but I think your story gives more context. So if you could share a little bit about your first rental experience.
Yeah, so this was my first home. This was late 2004. I want to say late 2004, we agreed to buy the place. I don't think we closed until January 2005 and paid $235,000 for it. 5 years later, four or 5 years later, when we grew out of that, it was a townhouse. It was coincided right with the 2008-2009 housing market crash. So I couldn't sell this $235,000 house for, I don't think I could even get $140,000. And I bought it when I was like early 20s. So I was still in my 20s when I tried to sell it. It was so underwater. I think we owed probably $220,000 on it. And so I became a landlord. Didn't want to become a landlord, but I was forced to become a landlord
out of circumstance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was so focused on my career at that point that I just wanted to hand it off to a property manager who was not a good property manager at all. And one of the mistakes I made, though, is I said, just no pets, no dogs.
Okay.
And what I realized, being a dog person, I love dogs. I think everybody in this, you guys both love dogs.
I'm a dog person. Sure.
And to be honest, anybody who doesn't love dogs, I mean, I would question their character. But so by excluding dogs, rather than just covering it with a security deposit, I in retrospect, I eliminated a massive chunk of the world's just really good people. And in retrospect, that was really a dumb idea. And then ultimately, my property manager, she wasn't like a veteran property manager by any means, but I said, just you find the tenant. And so in retrospect, credit scores. The best thing you can do is let people have pets, cover it with a security deposit.
Sure.
But check their credit scores, because people with good credit do not want to ruin that credit score.
Right. There's an incentive.
So I ended up with somebody who didn't even have a credit score and ended up being a squatter. So it was so painful. And I had to hire an attorney, and we could not get this individual out of my house. And he made a ill-advised comment to the judge, and the judge ended up saying, you're out of there. And thank goodness. But it was, and I sold it. I ended up selling it maybe like 8 years later, but I still had to write a $10,000 check just because I was under by $10,000.
But I would say those lessons are valuable for everybody listening.
Yeah.
Right. Because what did we learn from that? We learned vetting property managers. We may not know how to do that. Right.
Exactly.
Well, how would a consumer know to vet property managers? Right. You just may pick the first one you find, or you may pick the one your buddy uses.
Yeah.
Right. The second thing, your comment on dogs, that's a really deep perspective and philosophical, but I think it does add to the fact that there's another way to do it. And in hindsight, you could have. And then the credit score piece. Right. And then the fact that you wound up with somebody who squatted is a huge misfortune, but I think it just shows and shines on the need to have some cash aside, to have resources, because you had legal fees. You probably didn't see those legal fees coming.
Didn't
right?
see legal fees coming, and I was still paying the mortgage.
And you're still paying the mortgage.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to share that story because there's so much to be learned in that. And so thank you for sharing that.
And that was the second tenant. The first tenant, they paid their rent, but it was always like, it was 40 minutes away, and this tenant would drive the check when they could just
inefficiency.
On the day it was due, if not the day after. So that was more a mistake that I realize in retrospect, rather than me being just shrugging off rentals for individuals. But it was definitely.
But I think it's a learning process, and I think it helps inform how your firm works with people with rentals. And I think having the cash surplus. So that kind of leads me to the next point on that is, we talk a little bit about risk management, right? And you brought up the LLC, some limited protection, piercing the veil. But when it comes to even the basics of P&C coverage, right? Do y'all leave that up to the client to figure out, or do you give a little advice? Are there agents you use more commonly, or do you usually stick with the agent who comes with the client when they meet with you?
Yeah, these are all great questions. So,
and I don't think there's right answers to them. I'm curious.
I don't think there's a right answer either. This is the way that we've found that it has been in the client's best interest to do this. So yes, we do incorporate that. We don't sell those products.
Sure.
So it's pure.
Yep.
If there is a change, we will always tell the client to go back. If you like the individual that you initially spoke to, so let's say they have a $300,000 personal liability on the rental policy, and we say, hey, let's increase that to $500,000 and potentially add an umbrella insurance for that business itself to cover in addition to that personal liability. We will always tell them to go back to their initial personal or property and casualty agent and say, hey, can you update that? Or if they come back to us and say, no, I actually don't really like that individual. I tried. Why didn't they come to me and say that in the first place when I gave them information? Yeah. We will refer them to a broker and have the broker ultimately run quotes for the individual and quote that out. But yes, we will review all property and casualty, not only personally, but also for the business, and make recommendations to increase it if they are subpar or not to the standard that we
and we met with a younger married couple in their 30s 2 weeks ago. And so he had a place out in Colorado. She had a place in Wheaton, Illinois. He moved to Wheaton. He's from Wheaton, but he still has the Colorado house, and he hired a property manager. They made him do insurance through them, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll share my rental story, which is a story of property casualty coverage too, right? And I hopefully we can learn some lessons from this as well. But I lived in Havertown, Pennsylvania, and some older homes. I think I had a 100-year-old home, and I knew that because when there was a leak in the kitchen, the bathtub, the cast iron of the bathtub, it said like 1915, right? So you kind of knew the time period of this old house. And this house across the street is this lovely old couple when we moved in, and he passed, and unfortunately she passed right after. Yeah. So they both, this old couple passed really quickly, and the house sat empty for about 9 months. And so at some point in the game, I started doing some math with an Alex style Excel sheet. And I was like, well, I mean, okay, so the fair market value of this thing, if it was kept up and nice, is probably $350, but no one's making offers, no one's gonna look at it. One of the daughters is living there, but the yard's gotten ratty. And it's like, okay, well, what if an offer was made like in the twos, right? So I go in and I do that, and the daughter's like, she sells it. Right, she's like out. So here I am, and I think I've got this great bargain of a house. And of course, to this day, I regret not having a better inspection. But here nor there, right? That plays in later.
Yeah.
So it comes Christmas time, the family and fly to Houston, visit with my family, fly back, and New Year's I'll never forget. And it was right across the street. And going in, and I've been doing some work in the basement and the kitchen. And opening the door, and it's just a waterfall is like pouring through the house. And what wound up happening is that a radiator upstairs had failed and corroded. And the way that those old heating systems work is if there's not enough pressure, it just keeps pumping water. So for at least 4 or 5 days, I think it put like 30,000 gallons through this house from the top radiator down. But the lesson that I learned was this, is when I bought the house, I worked with a very strong mutual insurance company, and I was given the option, okay, if something were to happen for an extra $5 a month, we will cover rent that you would have been receiving, the rent that you would have received. And right before we left for the holidays, I'd worked with a property company to actually sign someone to rent the house, and that was good. Yeah. So the 12 months it took to fix it, I was getting the insurance company paying the rent benefit and the cost of repairs. So the smartest decision I think I made was checking that box for the $5.
Yeah.
Right? Because at the end of the day, it was a failure. It was an accident. It was the radiator literally upstairs had blown out the side, and that's what did the damage. Like a tiny piece, like as big as my palm. It like ruined the whole house. Isn't that crazy? Man. But in the end, then the house was rebuilt up to code, sold for a significant windfall financially for me. And all I think at the end of the day, because I checked that one little box, right? And I think there's a lesson there in P&C and saying, when you go into this sort of environment, having the right insurance, but not trying to be cheap about it necessarily either, right? Because if I had cheaped out on that would have been around $36,000-$40,000. I would have been out. I don't know how I would have paid for it at the time, right? I guess another mortgage on my house across the street,
yes,
right?
Well, and that's why as a practice, we obviously do all the stocks and bonds and whatnot, but we look at tax returns, we look at like employee benefits, but the one thing that we always look at is somebody's property and casualty, homeowners insurance, et cetera. And we have situations where there was one particular client who had an umbrella policy with one company, and it stipulated that on your auto policy, you needed to carry a certain amount of liability. These companies were not the same. And thankfully we caught it because the umbrella policy would have been invalid. And
in this case, it worked out, it wound up working out well for a year of really a lot of stress.
Yeah.
And then I also kind of regret living across the street because then you get to see when the contractors weren't there.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. And you're like, hey, you haven't been there for like 9 days. And it's raining. Yeah. It's like, you want to, anyway. But it's a lesson in P&C. And I think that, to me, when I think of rental the rest of my life, I'll always think P&C coverage. Yeah, right? Absolutely. Like that's where my mind goes like that. And just like I'm sure your mind goes places too when you think the word rental.
And just forget about the fact that whether it's rented or not, you own a property.
Yeah.
And things break in a property. I live in a house that was built October 1st, 1919. And I know that because when we remodeled the basement, the person that built it wrote up on one of the floor joists, S&C Construction, October 1st, 1919, $1,630 paid. So when we painted the ceiling, we left that.
I would too.
But ultimately, it's an old house and that has its challenges. So we decided to replace 7 of the windows, and they were not inexpensive by any means. It cost like $18,000 to replace those windows, which we budgeted for. But what we did not budget for was the tankless hot water heater going out, and then the AC unit going out, and then you have to replace the furnace with the AC
that's the
unit.
whole thing.
So what was an $18,000 job ended up being $30,000. So these are things that whether you're renting a house or not, that's why you got to make sure you have cash
and capacity.
Yeah, capacity, cash just to fix things that break.
Well, let me end our conversation on rentals and just kind of going to everybody, and we'll ask the same question, right? So you're talking with a financial advisor, and that financial advisor has a client considering rental property. What's 1 or 2 pieces of advice that you could summarize and give that person?
Start with you.
I would say make sure that you have the right property casualty insurance, as well as understanding the tax implications from that side. I know we didn't touch on tax implications, but there's a lot of tax implications that occur as a result of owning a property. So I would say those 2, property and casualty, and making sure that you understand tax implications, and having, I guess if I can add a third, it would be having adequate reserves as well.
Well, I mean, we have more time. Let's go ahead and nail tax implications.
Yeah. So absolutely. And this comes up quite a bit with individuals that they get really excited for the depreciation aspect of a property, meaning that it will offset some or maybe all of the income that's being generated from the property itself. But they don't understand when they sell the property that they have to recapture all of that depreciation, and then they get a large tax bill and they're saying, how am I going to pay for this? I'm going to sell from the house, I guess, and use the proceeds from the house. So there's a lot of implications from the fact that you do need depreciation is not free. You have to recapture that. There are ways around it, meaning a 1031 exchange. Excuse me, I always get those messed up. A 1031 exchange, but those come with headaches as well. So from that side of things, you always want to make sure that you have you understand what taking the depreciation is, and making sure that you have reserves to set aside, or if you're going to buy a new property with the proceeds of the next property or whatever that may be, that you have the adequate timing and things like that nailed down as well.
And Alex is the spreadsheet nerd, tax nerd.
So I'm
like, that's why I point at him to get into the details.
So what advice would you give? Young financial advisor, client wants to buy a rental. What do you say? I'm
just going to say, okay, obviously this is why it's nice to have a team. Alex can cover that, or Donovan or Anna. But I hit with just like is this going to be fun for you? Like, are you handy, first of all? Everybody jokes around that I'm not handy. Alex,
he is not.
Oh my goodness, really? So
he has his contractor over to replace a light bulb.
Yeah, exactly. So Mike Murray, shout out to Mike Murray. But if you're not handy, hire a property manager, and then make sure that the property manager also, like, don't project that this is going to be occupied 12 months out of the year. Maybe if you're doing financial projections, maybe if you want to be really pessimistic, go 9 months out of the year. If you want to be somewhat optimistic, do 11 months out of the year in your projections. But then you got to make sure that, are you covering is the incoming rent covering all of the ongoing expenses? That includes a mortgage, property taxes, repairs. So that's basically what I would advise. And more often than not, we try to talk people out of it, because if somebody's asking us, they're going to be rookies at it. And if they've done it before, they might ask us just to run the math, but they know what they're doing.
And I'll add on to Randy's comment of saying talk them out of it. We may talk them out of the rental property, but we may talk them into a publicly traded REIT, for example, that they may not be handy enough. So going back to the comments earlier.
Yeah.
So I would add that the takeaway I've gotten from our conversation today is that if I'm advising a young financial planner or I'm teaching a CFP class, I think we need to not ignore a rental property. No, I think we need to consider it, that it is a path to a lot of Americans building wealth. I think that we need processes in our practices to objectively evaluate is this a good decision? We need to consider generational wealth to some extent, right?
Yeah.
That what may have worked for a parent may not work for an adult child, and we need to consider that too.
Yep.
And then I also think just reinforcing, okay, do you have the process as an advisor to look at that insurance coverage? Do you have the process as an advisor to look at, look what kind of surplus we want and those kind of things? Because I think at the end of the day, if we have the processes as a firm, which is one of the things I love about Model Wealth, you're very process driven. And I think those processes allow us to make an informed decision. And so before we give any advice to a client, let's get all those in place.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just say, because I think I poo-pooed the idea of a rental property, and that's just more from experience, but rental properties can be phenomenal investments in the right circumstances.
In the right circumstances.
Exactly. Unfortunately, too many individuals don't look at the upside and don't consider the downside.
No. And I think vetting and processes certainly help that objective take is that this isn't for everybody. And I just really appreciate all of our conversations around it today. So thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. No
problem.
Thank you.